Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ben Self. I'm Vice President of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation in Washington, D.C. We have offices in Tokyo and Missoula, Montana as well, but I'm here in cold, rainy Washington where we're still in winter's grip. And for that reason, I'm grateful that this is a virtual seminar and we're not out in the rain. We do look forward to resuming in-person meetings as soon as public health guidance informs us it's safe to do so. And we promise to welcome you with a cup of hot coffee, the way Ambassador Mansfield famously served coffee to his guests at the embassy. But this virtual seminar, this webinar, is part of a series of special webinars sponsored by the Embassy of Japan. And I'd like to thank the embassy for their support, and in particular, the Public Affairs section, which has been such a wonderful partner in promoting the mutual understanding that we see as a critical component of US-Japan bilateral cooperation. So thanks to them. I'd be remiss also in not thanking the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, which has sponsored the US-Japan Network for the Future for over a decade and provides us with a community of experts who have helped us put together this series of webinars, highlighting areas, discrete areas of US-Japan cooperation. Today's event, US-Japan Alignment on Energy Policy, Goals and Strategies, is, I think, the third in our series, with several more coming up just before the end of the fiscal year and next week and the week after. So please do consider joining us for those on space policy, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and maritime security, areas of important bilateral cooperation. Today's event actually also echoes an event we did just over 2 years ago, also with the support of the Embassy of Japan, that time physically at the old ambassador's residence, also with the support of the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, and also with these two panelists. At that time, Phillip and Mary were kind enough to travel to Washington and join us to discuss Japan's energy and climate change conundrum. It was very much focused on Japan and not the bilateral US-Japan relationship. And so we're not worried that there'll be too much overlap or that we'll be repeating ourselves. Also, I think a lot has changed in 2 years. And now we have a Biden administration and a Suga administration, and we have a new set of issues. So I'm very eager to hear what they have to share with us today. Their bios are on the invitation, and so you've seen those already, but very briefly, Phillip Lipscy is an associate professor of political science at the University of Toronto. He's also chair in Japanese politics and global affairs and serves as the director of the Center for the Study of Global Japan at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. It's a lot. He's a busy guy. Phillip was in cohort 1, our inaugural group of the US-Japan Network for the Future, and joined us, as I mentioned, 2 years ago for that special event. Dr. Mary McCarthy is an associate professor of political science at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, where she also teaches on Japan as well as East Asia, including China and Korea, and studies international relations and also comparative politics. So incredibly comprehensive, and we're grateful to both of them for joining us today. Our agenda here is about 15 minutes of comments from each of them, then a little bit of discussion, and we'll open it up for questions and answers, or including audience discussion. Please use the chat function or the Q&A function to share your questions with us. We won't be able to call on you to speak, but if you can just type your questions into the Q&A at any time, we'll get to them by the end of the session today. So I've already talked too much, and I'd like to hand it over to Phillip, but thank you both again for joining us.
Well, thank you, Ben, for that kind introduction, and thank you to Frank and Tim, as well as the Mansfield Foundation for having us, and to the Embassy and CGP for supporting the event. It's a great pleasure to revisit this topic. I would certainly love to be in DC with all of you, but I guess this is the best alternative under the circumstances. So let me talk about climate cooperation, and Mary will touch more on energy security issues is the way we're planning the event today. And what I'll start with is kind of a brief review of the climate change policymaking context in Japan. And this is under the assumption that most of you will be familiar with what's going on in the US on this issue. And then I'll talk about the recent changes, as Ben alluded to, that are happening under the Suga and Biden administrations. And finally, I'll cover some promising areas, in my view, for US-Japan cooperation on this issue. So I think, when thinking about energy and climate policy in Japan, it's useful to wind back a little bit to the 1970s, which is really when government intervention in the energy sector took off in a meaningful sense during the oil shocks of 73 and 79. And Japan at the time, of course, was known for a very effective response to the oil shocks, emphasizing energy conservation and energy efficiency. And there was a significant contribution from industrial policy. But as I've shown in my own work, an important part of the story was the imposition of high energy costs on Japanese consumers and policies that basically redistributed the revenues and rents raised from those policies to organized supporters of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. And in many ways, these policies, I argue, that became unsustainable because of institutional changes and other changes that have taken place in Japan, particularly since the 1990s. Electoral reform is an important one that basically empowered consumers and made it difficult to sustain very high consumer prices on energy. And these changes that were making it more difficult for Japan to keep energy prices high happened to coincide with intensifying global concerns about climate change. And the combination of these two things basically created a circumstance where Japan ends up underperforming on climate change mitigation, despite its laudable previous record, and intensifying global concerns. For example, under the Kyoto Protocol, Japan was one of the worst performing countries. It saw its emissions increase in absolute terms, and it basically had to use flexibility mechanisms to meet its target. Other countries did worse on a per economy basis, but this was certainly not an impressive performance from a country that we often associate with green technology and various efficiency energy saving technologies. Furthermore, Japan, of course, has depended very heavily on imported fossil fuels that are a key source of CO2 emissions. It has had, compared to other advanced industrialized countries, limited development of renewable energy, despite its energy security issues. And this is all compounded, of course, by the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, which exacerbates the energy supply challenge and shuts down nuclear reactors, which, for all their problems, of course, don't emit much in the way of CO2. So as global concerns are increasing over climate change, Japan finds itself in a very difficult predicament. And so it's in this context that the Abe government came to power in 2012. And what I'm going to say draws a little bit on this edited volume that just recently came out, edited by Takeo Hoshi and myself, on the Abe government and Abenomics reforms. Mary has a very nice chapter in this as well. So pick up your copy today. Also very useful as a paperweight. But in any case, the Abe government, as Trevor Inserti and I argue in this volume, tended to place greater priority on economic growth rather than climate change mitigation, right? Abe personally was not very interested in climate change. He was more interested in how energy policy could be brought to bear on Japan's economic growth objectives. And the trade-off during the Abe government tended towards reducing energy prices, increasing competition, deregulating electricity prices. I think critically, the Abe government rolled back the feed-in tariffs that the Kan government had put in place under the DPJ years. And that really kind of slowed down the installation of renewable energy in Japan. And I think this was somewhat problematic. I think this is where Japan should have been doing much more during the Abe years. But of course, the Abe government was also criticized for its support for coal-fired power plants, not just domestically in response to the Fukushima disaster, but also supporting the construction of coal-fired power plants as part of Japanese ODA in other countries. And so the NGO community very heavily criticized Japan during this period. The Abe government, to its credit, did also come out and support various green policies. And, definitely the Abe government never came out publicly and denied climate change, right? So the Japanese government has never taken the extreme stance of climate denialism that we've seen from some leaders in the United States and Australia, for example. And, in areas like hydrogen fuel cells, the Abe government made significant investments and progress. This is a controversial one because it certainly benefits Japanese firms. Japanese automobile firms, for example, have advantages in these technologies, but there's quite a bit of skepticism out there about whether this is really where the future is. Electric vehicles, in the view of most experts, are probably going to dominate over hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. But certainly in industrial applications, fuel cells are probably going to be an important technology. And the Abe government certainly made progress there. Climate change commitments under the Abe government were an area, again, where I think the consensus tends to be there were major disappointments. The government, I won't go into great details, but essentially tried to put a happy face on a relatively discouraging situation, changing the base year from 1990 to 2013, for example, to try to make it look like Japanese emissions were being reduced at a rate comparable to the European Union, whereas if you use the 1990 baseline that was embedded in the Kyoto Protocol, Japan's emissions reductions were just about in line with the United States, which has had a very problematic relationship with global climate change efforts. So the punchline here, I think, is to say that the Abe government really wasn't placing a great deal of actual de facto policy prioritization on climate change. And this was reflected in various climate change rankings that saw the Japanese government decline to very low levels. German Watch puts together a climate ranking, and Japan came in the bottom decile during the Abe years. It bounced around before then. It wasn't ever in the top, but really in the bottom of that ranking. The Yale Environmental Performance Index, Japan was at various points ranked below the United States under the Trump administration. Right. So again, the Japanese government has never been unhelpful in the sense of disputing the science of climate change. But in terms of policy implementation, I think many of us as scholars who study this felt like Japan could do more. And so I think the punchline with the US and Japan coming up to the present time was that, the Trump and Abe governments took very different public positions on the issue of climate change, but both countries were failing really to exert significant domestic or international leadership. Now, the transition to the Biden and Suga administrations significantly alters this picture. And I think that's worth thinking about, right? The Suga government, of course, when it came to power, very prominently announced that Japan would commit to pursue net zero emissions by 2050. And I think this was a very smart political move by Suga because his government it would be very easy to see Suga as Abe Part 2, right? He was chief cabinet secretary for the duration of the Abe government. And it looked like, maybe these would be the same people policy-wise, but he came out and very clearly distinguished himself and put climate change front and center. And this was certainly an encouraging development because, as political scientists would tell you, in today's Japan, the prime minister does have very significant authority. And when the prime minister commits very publicly to an issue like this, that can certainly move the needle. and the substance, I think, is beginning to build there as well, right? Environment Minister Koizumi has committed to doubling the share of renewable energy in Japan within the next decade. METI has come out with a growth strategy report focusing on decarbonization as an economic strategy. And I think this is an important difference, right? So setting up decarbonization as an economic strategy, as opposed to looking at climate change as something that introduces a trade-off between growth and emissions mitigation. I think that's an important step. And so these are all encouraging developments. But of course, there's also a problem in that a 2050 target introduces very little accountability to present leaders. Suga, of course, is not going to be prime minister in 2050. Essentially no politicians currently in power are going to be around by then. And so the major question is, can Japan make gradual progress in line with that goal? Can the momentum be sustained beyond the end of the Suga government when it comes? I think the Biden administration in many ways is analogous, right? You obviously had under the Trump administration kind of a climate skeptic government, the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and many of these Trump policies are being reversed already under the Biden administration. Biden administration similar committed to net zero emissions by 2050. And I think a key question will be the infrastructure package that the Biden administration is pushing forward. That's really where a lot of the climate initiative is going to lie. And so whether that manages to get through Congress, I think is going to make a big difference in terms of Biden climate policy. But I think the US is back also in terms of global leadership on climate. And so that is a non-trivial change, obviously. But I think both governments also face significant challenges. And I think the key challenge for both governments, it has to do with policy volatility. And I think in the US, this one's obvious, right? Climate change has become a partisan issue. And the pattern, you can go all the way back to Carter and Reagan, right? Carter put solar panels on the White House rooftop and Reagan put them away, right? And it's been a similar pattern since, where Democratic governments are pro-climate and try to move the needle on emissions reductions. And then Republican administrations come in and reverse those policies. So you go back and forth. But I would argue that Japan has had a somewhat similar problem in recent years. Reflecting two factors: the fact that Japanese consumers are cost sensitive, and so there's a little bit of a political incentive to roll back high energy prices that encourage conservation, but also the fact that there's so much authority now centralized in the Japanese prime minister means that the personal priority of the prime ministers matters a lot. And so from Kan to Abe to Suga, we've seen similar types of volatility in Japanese policymaking surrounding climate. It's not partisan, but it does introduce this question of, can there be more stability brought into the policymaking process in Japan as well? So moving forward, I think both countries face this important task of how to reduce policymaking volatility and create a stable environment. After all, stability is critical in this area because for private investments to take place, you have to have some sense that subsidies are going to be there, the policy, taxes, they're not all going to be rolled back when a new government comes into power. And the standard answer to this kind of problem would be institutionalization, create an agency, commit to an international agreement. But that's, in the US context, I think, been shown not to work, right? Because these are also reversible ultimately. But I think can be some progress made, and particularly surrounding these large fiscal outlays that are taking place around COVID-19 response, putting that money in places where you can promote relatively irreversible changes, right? Green infrastructure investments, subsidies for renewable energy. Once you put that in there, it's hard to take it back. Public transportation infrastructure, electric vehicles, all of these things are ways that you can leverage this large fiscal spending that's taking place. I think in Japan, promoting cross-party consensus around climate change goals can be important. I don't know that this is possible in the United States, but in Japan, there's enough public support and politicians, I think, are flexible enough that you might be able to move the needle by getting politicians across the aisle on board with climate change goals. And finally, on areas for international cooperation. I think international rule setting is an area where both countries should be more actively involved. The EU recently came out with border tax adjustments on, to basically try to reduce the price differential that comes from differential regulation of climate-related emissions. And I think there needs to be more cooperation on rule setting for this type of thing. And it's something that the United States and Japan could also benefit from, but it shouldn't be a free-for-all because that raises the danger of capture by protectionism, right? This type of policy can be abused. I think there's a lot of space that still remains for the joint development of green technology, right? Each country has a somewhat different specialization and technological focus. There's a lot of joint support, right? Japan, for example, has much better technology in terms of bullet trains, that could be part of the solution. If you've ever been on the Acela, obviously, the United States has quite a bit to learn from Japan in that kind of area. Multilateral cooperation on strengthening the Paris Agreement is an area I think absolutely that both countries need to cooperate on. And finally, I would say that framing is also something that should be thought of more, right? One thing about the COVID-19 pandemic was the vaccine race became seen as a little bit of a national prestige issue. And who can develop this solution to the global pandemic first? And climate change has typically been framed more like who's going to bear the burden of adjusting to climate change, who's going to reduce their emissions. But it has something of a similar dynamic. And if you can change it into a competitive race, is the US or is Japan going to be the first country that gets to net zero emissions? Which country, China or the US, is going to be able to increase their renewable share more rapidly? So introducing those kinds of competitive dynamics that contribute ultimately to public goods, I think changing that conversation and framing, I think that could be an area where both countries could work together as well. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Mary.
Thank you, Philip. That was wonderful. Straight over, please, Mary, go ahead.
Thanks, Ben. And I want to reiterate Philip's thanks to Frank and Ben and Tim for the invitation to speak this evening, for the support of the Japanese Embassy and CGP, and also for the really insightful and reflective comments from Philip. I appreciate that as a lead-in to what I'm going to speak about tonight. So we know that Japan and the US have a strong existing energy partnership. They share a number of common interests and priority areas, and there are new potential areas for cooperation and collaboration, particularly with the energy policy agenda set forth by the Biden administration, as well as the benchmark set for 2030 and for 2050 in Japan's 5th Strategic Energy Plan. But we also need to be aware of potential fault lines, areas where Japan and the US have not been on the same page in the past, or where there might be differing priorities moving forward. Given my focus in this presentation on energy security, as Philip said, I'm going to start with common priorities in the achievement of energy security. So first, the US and Japan share a common interest in stable and secure energy markets in the Indo-Pacific and throughout the world. The Japan-US Strategic Energy Partnership, JUSEP, launched in 2017, was created as a core feature of energy security for both countries and was integrated as part of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So US-Japan energy cooperation can be seen as part of this larger geostrategic strategy in the region and around the world. In terms of past cooperation, the US-Japan Energy Partnership has focused on trade, investment, and joint technology research and development, as well as technology sharing. Nuclear energy technology has been a major pillar of cooperation for decades, as Japan is the US's oldest civil nuclear partner. Natural gas has been a significant component since the US opened up foreign exports of its liquefied natural gas LNG in 2016. So under the Trump administration, we saw the partnership really emphasize these two components, nuclear energy and LNG. So in terms of LNG, Japan is the largest LNG buyer in the world. According to the International Trade Association of the US Department of Commerce, since the United States began its LNG export in February 2016, 10.3% of its accumulated volume has been shipped to Japan. The US is currently Japan's 8th largest supplying country. And as of May 2020, Japan was the 3rd largest buyer of US LNG after South Korea and Mexico. So the US sees Japan as an important LNG partner in a number of ways, actually. First, in terms of the Japanese purchase of LNG produced in the US. Second, in terms of Japanese investment in US LNG infrastructure. And third, as a partner in US-Japan collaboration on third-party infrastructure projects that source US LNG. And the Japan-US Strategic Energy Partnership has emphasized this in terms of investment in LNG infrastructure and supply with projects in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So in this way, Japan has been helping the US to sell its LNG, but it's also a business opportunity for Japan, where there is expertise in the transport of LNG and the construction and operation of LNG power plants. It's also a diplomatic initiative, strengthening diplomatic ties across the region, in part as a response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. US-Japan collaboration on promoting more LNG infrastructure and US-produced LNG supplies is sold as an alternative to China's coal-fired power plants and related energy infrastructure. Related to this, in 2019, the Japan-US Mekong Power Partnership, JUMP, was inaugurated. In their joint statement, the US and Japan stated that they value transparency, free and fair competition, and the unfettered flow of energy supplies in the Indo-Pacific region, which is vital to the stability and development of the region. The United States and Japan pledged to partner with Mekong countries to maintain and promote a more sustainable energy sector and quality energy infrastructure development that meets the needs of the people of the Mekong. Projects that fall under JUMP include working with Thailand's main electric utility company on things like grid modernization, helping countries of Southeast Asia to meet their electricity needs, which are expected to increase exponentially annually, is of prime importance as part of this partnership between the US and Japan. So all of this highlights how JUSEP has been an economic, energy security, diplomatic, and business partnership with public-private cooperation as its backdrop. We will have to see, however, if the Biden administration is as set on increasing LNG exports or maintaining LNG exports as the Trump administration was, given a greater emphasis on clean energy technologies and renewables, as well as more concern about climate change. But this is also where the new business and other collaborative opportunities exist for a Japan-US strategic clean energy partnership. And this builds on what Phillip was just talking about in terms of these areas where Japan and the US complement each other in terms of technological prowess and can work together moving forward. As Phillip mentioned, both Biden and Suga have committed to net zero by 2050, and the US has rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. With the Biden administration focus on clean energy technologies, there's the potential for significant growth in cooperation in this area, including in terms of business opportunities, as well as joint research and development and technology sharing. And we've already seen some movement here, some opportunities being discussed with this idea for the Japan-US Strategic Clean Energy Partnership. A further development or evolution of the GSEP, perhaps responding to what Phillip said is, okay, a new administration comes in, 2 administrations are in, 6 months of Suga administration, 2 months of the Biden administration. What are we going to see in terms of their priorities and movement forward where the US and Japan can further cooperate given these new priorities? So the areas for ongoing and new collaborations are rich. For example, Blakemore and Yellen published a paper for the Atlantic Council last year, making what I thought was a good argument for Japan-US partnership on smart grid technology, among other areas. The needs are apparent there for smart grid technology. Both the US and Japan are obviously in need of upgrades and ways of integrating renewables into the grid, and what each partner could bring to technological and policy innovation is clear. So each having their own strengths in these areas. This also connects with geostrategic strategy once again. Even though Japan has been doing R&D in clean energy technologies, obviously, it has had trouble bringing those technologies to the market. The US has brought clean technologies to the market, but in many cases lost their market share to Chinese businesses. China has become a leader in many areas of clean energy technologies, but in partnership, Japan and the US may be able to compete more effectively with China. Japan's 6th strategic energy plan is due to be released in 2021. The review of the past plan began in October and is set to continue over the coming months. And I expect that there will be ongoing consultations between the US and Japan that will somewhat inform that review. So we are likely to see some of these initiatives, these existing as well as new areas for cooperation and collaboration taken into account in the new strategic energy plan. Still, despite these vast areas for ongoing and new cooperation between Japan and the US, we can't ignore the differences in terms of energy security challenges that exist between the two countries and how that may or may not lead to different priorities and different policy decisions. As we all know, 3/11 was the 10th anniversary of the tripartite disaster, the aftermath of which saw a significant shift in Japan's energy mix. Low energy self-sufficiency means that a stable supply has always been a top concern for Japan, but the Fukushima nuclear disaster further decreased self-sufficiency and increased reliance on fossil fuels. Japan's 2020 Energy White Paper, which came out last June, emphasized stable supply, energy efficiency, renewable energy, nuclear policy, and international cooperation. But a 2020 policy examination conducted by Hattori and Chen found that it's really energy security and economic efficiency that have been the driving factors of Japan's energy policy, with climate change important but secondary behind the other two. And Phillip went into some detail about why this is the case and what his research findings have been in this area. So looking at energy realities and energy challenges for Japan and the US, There are two things I want to highlight with regard to possible frictions in bilateral cooperation and partnership. The first is Japanese energy vulnerability. Japan relies on foreign sources for almost 96% of its primary domestic energy consumption. It depends on the Middle East for about 88% of its crude oil supply, making it highly vulnerable to tensions or instability in the region. On the other hand, the US is close to energy self-sufficiency and doesn't rely much on the Persian Gulf for its energy imports, becoming a net exporter of crude oil and petroleum products in 2019. Now, this does not mean, of course, that the US is energy independent. It is not, nor does it mean that the situation in the Middle East has become geopolitically of no concern to the US. We all know that energy is a global market. Instability in the Middle East could impact energy supplies and prices, causing worldwide market disruptions that affect the US. So while the US doesn't have Japan's vulnerability, it still does have a sensitivity. But this difference in terms of needs and concerns between the US and Japan is clear, and therefore potentially leading to different priorities. Second, the Japanese government still retains a focus on the primacy of fossil fuels for meeting its energy needs, even if the ultimate goal is decarbonization. And in 2019, Phillip, Daniel Aldrich, and I published a couple of pieces calling attention to where action has failed to meet rhetoric in Japanese clean energy policy. And of particular concern, as Phillip mentioned, has been coal-fired power plants. Although policy changes were announced last summer, there have been recent lawsuits in Japan where domestic coal-powered power plants have been built or are being built with claims that environmental concerns were not addressed. And there has been financing, as Phillip mentioned, of coal-fired power plants overseas. And these power plants have a lifespan of 30 years or so, so unlikely to be phased out in the near future. So it is concern, even if there is a change, a shift in Japanese policy in these areas, that some of the damage has already been done. So this is a question I have for Phillip, actually, and I'm curious to hear his opinion, if he's interested, if we have time, how he assesses the statements by METI and Minister for the Environment, Koizumi, during the summer about the end of financing for coal-powered power plants. Is this rhetoric? Is this action? And will we see tension between the US and Japan on coal-fired power plants during the Biden administration, like we did during the Obama years? Or with its eye on 2050, Phillip talked about perhaps there isn't great accountability looking toward so far in the future as 2050, but with its eye on 2050, has Japan set up a plan to sufficiently address that in a way that puts the two governments on the same page? So I'm going to end with that question, and thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and also thank you again, Phillip. Those were wonderful and rich and very provocative presentations. We already have a number of questions in the Q&A, in addition to Mary's question, and a couple that were sent in by email, and now I see one in the chat as well. Fast and furious. I would like to try and organize them thematically around the different, basically, energy source categories, because we have renewables, we have nuclear, we have fossil fuels, and I guess we even have energy efficiency as a kind of separate category to consider. And I'd like to start with the nuclear dimension, because that was emailed in. And we also have one from our board member, Russ Deming. Ambassador Deming asks, is there any future for nuclear power as a bridge in Japan's energy strategy? Should we write off nuclear power as a low carbon bridge to renewables? Or if not, is there potential for US-Japan cooperation in this area? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on nuclear power. Those are similar questions were raised by Andrew Horvath. So I think as long as you can address where we stand with the prospect for restarts or small modular reactors, collaborative research on nuclear power, and its role. And Philip, if you wouldn't mind starting, I know you've written on this in the past.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the striking things about Japanese politics post-Fukushima is the fact of LDP dominance of politics at almost all levels, despite the fact that the LDP is essentially the only party pushing nuclear energy, right? The opposition parties almost uniformly came out and sought to take advantage of anti-nuclear sentiment after Fukushima and said, we're going to go to zero nuclear. The LDP basically landed at the most pro-nuclear stance, and it doesn't seem to have hurt them politically. And so based on that, I would say that nuclear energy certainly does have a future in Japan. It doesn't seem to be a significant enough issue to turn the public against the LDP, holding other things constant. And the LDP is certainly of the view, I'm drawing a very broad stroke here, but the party's position on this is that nuclear, it needs to be part of the solution. And, I think on restarts, my sense is they will probably be successful ultimately. There's still local opposition to restarts in various areas, but I think that in many cases might be overcome. Building new reactors, I think, is a very different story. I think that is an area where Japan is probably not going to be able to do much more. So I think the bridge idea is really accurate, right? I think the outcome will ultimately be in the long-term renewables is going to increase, and nuclear will remain part of the energy mix and a low carbon part of the energy mix. If you look at public opinion polling, the Japanese public has a view that zero nuclear would be ideal, but we don't think we can go there immediately. And so, I think the general consensus is gradual phase out. And my assessment would be that's probably where things are going to end up. But Mary might have views on this as well.
Yeah, I'd like to turn to Mary if you can also chime in. And in particular, if you might address Emma Chanlett-Avery's question about Koizumi Jr. And Koizumi Sr. and the two Koizumis having policy positions vis-a-vis nuclear that might be slightly different. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, or more broadly on the question of nuclear power, as you mentioned, an indigenous power source, not imported. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I have to say that I agree with Philip on all points, actually. We have seen, and I think there is proof of this in both the US and Japan, that citizens are not voting on the nuclear issue, on the nuclear policy issue, that it is perceived as a bridge, that the LDP has shown itself as generally strongly behind this as a bridging technology. And we do not see a significant movement in renewables, which means this bridging technology would be more long-term than short-term. And we've also seen President Biden come out in support of nuclear energy, which means that there is an avenue for continued cooperation and collaboration between the US and Japan in these issues. In terms of Koizumi Jr., I actually do not know what his position is on this moving forward, but I will say that in terms of the Ministry of the Environment versus METI, and where energy policy has tended to stem from versus climate change policy or environmental policy, that we have seen those two E's, right? It's the three E's, and the third is environment. That environment has always gotten second-class citizenship, and we have seen this economic efficiency and energy security, the two E's that have been prioritized in Japan. So I think we're going to continue to see that.
So just to follow up on the Koizumi point, Emma's question, my impression is that Shinjiro Koizumi, the current environment minister, is not pro-nuclear, right? So I believe he's stated publicly that he would like to see nuclear go to zero. But he's not taking the position of his father, which is this has to happen immediately, and it's the most important issue. And so my sense is that he might prefer less reliance on nuclear, but is willing to work within the system and realizes that it's unlikely that that outcome is feasible in the near future. And so I'm kind of reading into what he's said publicly, but that would be my assessment of where he stands.
And thank you both. With apologies to Ken Haig, who also had a question about nuclear, I'd like to move us forward to talk about fossil fuels, because the questions of coal have come up, and also a lot of discussion about LNG. And we have questions, a couple of them in the chat, asking about the future US-Japan LNG cooperation framework and whether there's likely to be further expansion, status quo, or a gradual choking of the amount of LNG flowing out of the United States. So with apologies for paraphrasing all of those questions, what do you expect? I will start with Mary this time. What do you expect in terms of the ability of the LNG sector to sustain the growth it's seen, or sustain the present level of at least volume of flow, or anticipated already baked in increases in that flow based on what you've described, the infrastructure investments in third countries that will eventually lead to new destinations for US LNG that hasn't yet begun, right? So if everything that's already been spent or has been committed in terms of infrastructure expansion follows to its course, we'll reach a level of LNG exports. Is that the peak? Will we ever reach that peak? Or will we actually see, because of a coal LNG or oil LNG trade-offs, still some preference for liquefied natural gas? So over to you, Mary.
I think this could be its own webinar, just exploring the various aspects of this question. But I think we have to bring in first COVID and the way in which COVID has changed the energy market around the world, and the depressing effect on energy prices has had a variety of effects. And so the first effect, of course, is that now liquefied natural gas is extremely inexpensive. And so it is a very attractive option for those in Asia, those developing economies in Asia who are seeking to achieve greater energy security. And Japan, it has such expertise and has been doing so well in terms of developing the relationships in Southeast Asia, really bringing together public and private collaboration, bringing in Japanese government money so that developing economies can afford this infrastructure, bringing in the expertise, bringing in technical assistance. So Japan has done very well in this and will continue, I think, to emphasize bringing their LNG expertise to Southeast Asia. And now you do have the attractiveness of low prices. So I think this is definitely an opportunity that we see. In the COVID, post-COVID times, we will see this. Does it have a ceiling? I think that's where we have to bring in global climate change, because we're still talking about fossil fuels and we're still talking about, okay, this is cleaner energy. This isn't coal power. This isn't even clean coal, right? But what is the future? Where is the future? If we are talking about net zero, well, it's not LNG, right? It's renewables. And so that is the next conversation that has to be had, I think. And I'll stop here and send it over to Phillip.
I have nothing to add. Mary's the expert on this one. So if you want to talk more, you can, but I'll cede the floor.
Thank you, Phillip. We could do a whole webinar on that one, and certainly on renewables. We could easily spend an hour discussing US-Japan cooperation on renewable energy sector and the prospects there. Just 2 days ago, on the 16th of March, which would have been Mike Mansfield's 118th birthday, the State Department and the Japanese Foreign Ministry issued a statement about increasing the bilateral partnership, which is appropriate in memory of Mike Mansfield. And they highlighted both climate change and clean energy as two of the 5 areas where they will deepen bilateral cooperation. And it's really wonderful that you both have anticipated in preparing for tonight where the two governments are in their thinking on those important issues. And the clean energy element is very much focused on renewables. But in addition to renewables, which I'd like to get you to comment on, since we're running out of time so quickly, I'd also like your thoughts on 2 other aspects that deal with clean in terms of the energy. One is decarbonization of fossil fuels. We have a wonderful question from Masakazu Toyota about carbon capture and the reduction of the harmful aspects of burning fossil fuels so that they actually also become zero net emissions. I would love to get back to something Phillip worked on at Stanford when we were both at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center there. He involved me in a wonderful project on energy efficiency policies and highlighting the effectiveness at yielding economic growth without increasing energy consumption. And of course, in the context of climate change, it's even more important to produce economic growth while reducing the climate impact. Energy efficiency, and we have a couple of questions from Hiroki Takeuchi, also from the Network for the Future, that deal with energy efficiency. So I'd love to hear some thoughts about the ways that either efficiency or carbon capture could supplement these elements of the clean energy partnership. We have too many questions to get to, but if you could start to address both of those, and we'll go to Phillip first this time.
Yeah, I think the energy efficiency question is a great one. It's something I've looked at. I think, when you talk to Japanese officials, one of the things that they'll say is there isn't much low-hanging fruit in Japan because we did so much on energy efficiency before other countries, and I think there's some truth to that. And so I don't see further energy efficiency enhancements in Japan as necessarily being the easiest path. There are areas in Japan like insulation of housing where there could be quite a lot of progress and that should be prioritized. But I really think in the case of Japan, the core priority should be on renewables, because this is where Japan really lags compared to European countries for sure, but even the United States, and it's to a large degree a policy choice. The government has significant influence on rolling out renewable energy. And I always push the United Kingdom as an example that Japan should look to because the UK has been quite successful in recent years in its decarbonization efforts, despite a political system that in some ways has similarities to the United States and Japan that might make price mechanisms somewhat difficult politically. They focused on decarbonization of power generation and have made significant progress. And so, looking to other political systems for practical lessons that can be implemented domestically, and not just other countries, but also localities, right? What is California doing? Those kinds of information exchange about best practices, right? That's an area, aside from the technology cooperation, I think, which is also critical across a variety of sectors, right? One thing that we need to recognize is we don't know what technology is ultimately going to be the most effective solution, right? So I think it does have to be kind of all options, try to move forward on everything and see what turns out to be very effective. And, I think all of these, like hydrogen is a good example where, there's a lot of skepticism, but, if it becomes cost effective and you don't have to do what's being done now, right? Which is, ship the hydrogen over from Australia, right? Such that by the time it enters a vehicle in Japan, you've emitted just about the same amount of CO2 as you would burning oil, right? That's not going to work. But if you can solve those kinds of bottleneck problems, it could very much be part of the solution, and in specific applications for sure, right? So I think you can't sort of be selective, right? You really have to put your money on all the possible options and hope that you can solve the problem that way. It may still not be enough, but I think you can't be too picky. It would be my thought. Mary, go ahead.
Please, Mary.
I was just thinking that I really liked Philip's comment earlier during his presentation about how there is a growing recognition that there doesn't have to be a trade-off between economic growth and pursuing these low carbon, no carbon, decarbonization pathways forward. And that there are lots of opportunities, potential opportunities, economic opportunities for Japan and the US to cooperate together on these pathways moving forward. And I think that's something that really needs to be focused on and emphasized. And perhaps we have started to see, and at least in the rhetoric, we have started to see some recognition of that in discussions of a US-Japan partnership in terms of this potential for economic growth and decarbonization efforts to be working together. And I was thinking in particular in terms of these areas for renewable technologies, these areas for the US and Japan to work together in terms of research and development, in terms of technology transfer, in terms of where each of them excel, collaborating, and there is so much that has been discussed in terms of a green recovery in Europe with this post-COVID times, how Europe has been emphasizing green recovery, and this hasn't really been emphasized as much in the US or in Japan, but this is something to think about post-COVID, whether there are avenues for the US and Japan to work together with regard to a green recovery that continues to emphasize economic growth, energy security, but as well as decarbonization and working together on these clean energy technologies.
Thank you both so much. We could probably go on for 2 more hours. We're almost though at the end of our hour. So we'll drop some of the questions with my apologies to those who've asked them. I'd love to talk about the political power of private sector companies like Tokyo Electric and have your thoughts on that too, but we don't have time for that. What I would like is some final closing thoughts addressing the inside the Beltway question. What about the April Global Summit? What will the US and Japan be ready for something significant as they come to COP, whatever the number is, I'm sorry. I'm losing track here in Paris in just a few weeks. So everyone wants to know, will Biden and Suga be able to hammer out something significant in advance of the global agreement? The final thoughts on that, and thank you again.
Should I go first? I think there will be efforts to make an announcement that will be headline making. But I think it's worth re-emphasizing that the important thing is to make gradual progress. And we've seen already in Japan, right? Hatoyama came out with very ambitious CO2 mitigations targets that were, widely applauded, but then eventually sort of quietly reversed. And so, that's the situation you want to avoid. It's easy to say we're going to reduce emissions dramatically, but making progress little by little through policy implementation, I think that's where the action needs to be.
Excellent. Mary, last words?
I would just say that we have 2 new or relatively new administrations that for different reasons want to show a departure from the previous administration. So there'll definitely be strong efforts to make a statement of the US and Japan coming together with some new initiatives moving forward.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so very much for your time this evening, and thanks to our audience for joining us. I know you've stimulated a lot of questions, a real flurry. So I know you did a wonderful job, and thank you for that. Once again, thanks to the Embassy of Japan for sponsoring this. And I'll join Philip and Mary in thanking my colleagues, Frank Januzzi, and especially Tim White for organizing this series. Thanks, Tim, for your hard work. And with that, this meeting is closed. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.